Hello, hello, welcome to Good Thinking Live. Had a little glitch with the third-party streaming software that allows me to go from StreamYard to Good Thinking on LinkedIn Live and YouTube, but hopefully we have cleared up all the glitches and we are back live and running. Sorry, we're a little bit late. Now, I'm going to look on my phone to see your comments because it's easier to see them here, and also, I will then know that, in fact, we did go live this time. So welcome to Good Thinking Live. If you're new to the show, this is the show that allows us to spend just a little bit of time, just borrow actually, a little bit of time away from all the time we spend on what to think. From the time we're little kids in school till adults, if you're not thinking this way, you need to think this way, or do it like this, and spend a little bit less time on what to think and a little bit more time, just a little bit, on how to think. So that's the purpose of the show. If you are here, let me know where you're from, and there's going to be a lot of participation as usual. And if you have subscribed to my channel, Becky Saltzman, on YouTube, you can watch live, you can watch it later, and if you comment there, I will get back to you. But if you're watching on LinkedIn Live, you can comment in real time. It's a little harder to see the replay on LinkedIn Live. All right. As you know, we're finalizing the Good Thinking Manifesto, and if you want a copy of the Good Thinking Manifesto, you got to let me know in the comments, and when it comes back from the designer, you'll get your free copy of the Good Thinking Manifesto. Today's show is about fairness and ethics in decision making, and before we get right to it, I'm going to say hi to some people who are tuning in. We've got Mark, we've got Stephen. Welcome. Let me know where you're from, and we'll get started. First thing is, I will have a question for you. A little bit of background. I'm tuning in from Portland. This is the Portland scene here. And the reason I have this in my background is because Portland is has been in the news a lot lately, both nationally and internationally, as the Black Lives peaceful protests have also been met with some rioting. The federal enforcements were brought here, not to the pleasure of most Portland, but to some, and the rioting kind of ramped up. And now they're leaving and the rioting is ramped down. But that's not really the point that I'm making. The point is that a lot of windows were broken downtown. So here's the fairness and ethics in decision-making question to get us started. And that is, all these windows are broken in the downtown shops and restaurants. And I was walking downtown and I saw all of these trucks, these window repair trucks and companies. Given the fact that these riots have created all of these opportunities for these window repair companies to go in and repair windows, is it fair or is it ethical for those window repair companies to raise their prices? That's the first question. That'll kind of frame what we're doing today on the show regarding fairness and ethics in decision making. Is it fair for them to raise their prices? So you could say fair, unfair in the comments. We're going to be asking a lot of fair and unfair questions. So you might want to say regarding windows, or windows fair, unfair, or W fair, unfair, so we know in the stream what you're referring to. And I'll say hi to Rajiv from India. Fantastic. And we've got Dane from Portland, Oregon. We've got Stephen, love in Mount Hood, yes, and Mark. Good, we're all on the show. Is it fair for the window companies to raise their prices? All right, if the prices don't go up, then a lot of people who could afford windows, a lot of the companies that could afford to replace their windows, may not get to replace their windows because there's a long line for windows, and whoever it's first come, first served. And maybe also you could see a secondary market where people who hoard the windows, and who maybe hoard the windows or tie up the window manufacturers or the window installers, and then try to sell it on the secondary market. So is it fair? So we'll start with that basic question, and then we'll get into what if it's something different? What if there was a hurricane and we were dealing with generators? Like, if there's a hurricane, should the generators, the people who sell, the companies that sell generators, should they raise their prices? Or what about shovels in a snowstorm? Is that fair and ethical? And to whom? So those are some questions about our decisions, both as consumers, but also as as business people as we kind of navigate fairness and ethics in decision making and how it relates to good thinking. And you'll see there's a tie-in. All right, so that's the first question. And we've got Edson from Brazil. We've got people from all over the world. So this is great because fairness and ethics can be influenced by our cultural upbringings too. So we'll see. So we'll have some fun with that. Okay, here's the scenario. You're on a train or airplane, and you're sitting next to someone, and a person comes up that you don't know, and they say, "Hey, you two," and you look at the person next to you because you don't really know them that well. I mean, maybe you don't know them at all, but maybe you exchanged pleasantries when you first boarded. And they say, "Hey, you two, I've got $5,000 that you're going to split." And you go, "What? What is this? $5,000? And they turn to the person sitting next to you. Let's say that person is Mark. They say, "Mark, you're going to decide how the two of you are going to split this $5,000. Now, if you both agree to the split, you'll get the money. But if you don't agree to the split, then no one gets the money. You get zero." All right. So this is kind of a classic ethics, fairness, decision-making kind of game theory. The question is, we'll play with some different scenarios. The question is, what would you do? All right. In this example, Mark turns to you and says, "Okay, great. I'm going to give you $100 and I'm going to take $4,900. Is that fair? Would you take the $100 or would you penalize Mark because you perceive Mark to be unfair in offering you $100 out of the $5,000 that this random stranger offered for you to share?" All right, let me know what you're thinking in the comments as we go on. Now, when I present this, it takes a little bit longer for your comments to show, so there's like a lag on the live stream. So we'll play with some of the different framing and scenarios. What if, for you, $100, you're so rich that $100 is like nothing. So would you be more willing to punish Mark by saying no to that and having Mark not get the $4,900, his portion, for offering an unfair split? If you had a high income, would that matter? Or what if you knew Mark and Mark was your coworker? And would you be concerned that Mark might think you're a sucker if you do take that? Or would you think, hey, if he's a coworker, I'm not going to think as highly of him, or I'll have an opportunity to get back at him in some other way? Or what if he was someone that you didn't particularly engage with on the train to begin with, or you really liked on the train, you thought they were really nice? Does their gender matter? Does their race matter? Does your gender matter? How do we judge fairness when the framing of this particular scenario changes? And that's where you see that fairness is contextual. I mean, how we perceive fairness isn't the same from one context necessarily to the next. All right, so let me know if you guys, how you would respond to the scenario one where, and I'll look on here, look on your comments, if some kind of sort of stranger on the train offered you $100 and took $4,900 for themselves. Let me know, and we will see how you're thinking as we continue with ethics and fairness in decision making. All right, now economic theory would dismiss our concerns of fairness and ethics as not even important, superfluous to our decisions. But that's not what our decisions suggest. So those of you who are working in the economic realm, we know that behavioral science and behavioral economics has been a big part of debunking some of the things that we think that are, were rational. So it's just interesting because fairness is often inconsistent with our economic models. A couple of fun things to think about. It turns out that when if the person who offered you $5,000 was a computer, or if Mark was a computer and distributed the money, $100, $4,900, people tend to see that as being more fair than if Mark is a human. And this will have implications as we move into AI making a lot of decisions for us, and how we think of fairness and ethics as we move into the age of AI decisions or artificial intelligence decisions. Most research on fairness focuses on the distribution of resources and the fairness. Now, for example, a lot of people use the method of splitting the difference. And we think oftentimes splitting the difference is a very fair way to make decisions. But part of splitting the difference depends on where you start the anchor to begin with. So, for example, if I offer something to you that's worth $50, but I offer it to you for $50,000, and you say, well, I'm going to pay $25, and I say, well, then let's just split the difference. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Turns out that as you get closer to the reality of the value, splitting the difference really never really makes sense, but it seems fair in our brains. And our brains and our neurochemistry have very interesting patterns of how fairness is triggered when you look at functional MRI. So a lot of these things are neural in our human decision making. All right. Now, what happens also is that in terms of ethics, a lot of things that we think we're ethical. I don't think most of us would consider ourselves unethical people. So I have a question for you. If you had to choose, let me ask you, if you had to choose between what is more common, situation 1 or situation 2, let me know what you think is more common. But before you do, I'm going to say hi to a few people. All right. Stephen says, I could be influenced, as this is what I perceive as ethics, by whether or not I knew they had a need for the $4,900. Okay. So Stephen says, on the airplane example, if the person, in this case Mark, explained their reason for taking $4,900 of the $5,000 and giving $100 to him or to you, that there could be a reason for that seemingly unfair distribution, that would make it seem more fair. And I think that's completely legitimate. If we have a reason for perceiving or foreseeing someone's behavior as being unfair, then we kind of say, okay, I get that, and that's legitimate. All right. When it comes to decision making, what do you think happens more? Number 1, knowingly unethical behavior, like we're intentionally unethical, or number 2, unknowingly unethical behavior, meaning we don't intentionally act in an unethical way. What happens when you see unethical behavior? What do you think happens more frequently? Unethical people knowingly being unethical, or unknowingly being unethical? 1 or 2. So put in the comments which one you think is more common, because there's some really interesting research about this. And it turns out, I'll let you comment for a second. It turns out that unknowingly unethical behavior is way, 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 way more common than knowing ethical behavior. Well, how do they know? Well, that's where it gets a little difficult to parse out. But there are reasons that we make decisions that are unethical, potentially unknowingly. And when we understand these key reasons, we can get closer to making fair and ethical decisions. And why does this matter? Because one of the most important and the Good Thinking Manifesto is recognizing the cognitive biases in our own thinking. Now, we know that we can easily, once we learn about the cognitive biases, see them in other people all the time. But that's not one of the Good Thinking Manifesto bullet points of what constitutes a good thinker. What constitutes a good thinker is being able to see the cognitive biases in ourselves. So that's what we're going to go over, are the cognitive biases, or these traps that enable us to make unknowingly unethical decisions, and some tricks for overcoming them. So that's going to be the show. Ready? All right. Anyone else, let me know where you're from. Let me know your opinions. Of course, the scrolling is always a little bit clunky. I'm going to be looking at my phone so I can see the comments a little clearer because it's not that easy on the computer screen. And here we go. Let's see. All right. So let's see. Do we have any? Okay. Here they're coming to scroll. All right. So I've got it all set up. Ready for a story that will kind of explain how to think about the difference between knowing and unknowing ethicality. So in the 1970s, when Lee Iacocca was running Ford, they were in a big competition with Volkswagen, and they were working on their Ford Pinto, which was going to be like the big car that was going to compete with the Volkswagen. And this was a time people look at Lee Iacocca as a genius CEO, and engineers had discovered that there were some flaws with the fuel tank that was in the back of the car, that upon contact, the fuel tank could explode. But the culture there was based on all the decision making rather was based on a cost benefit analysis. So as the engineers and the marketing professionals looked at the cost benefit analysis, meaning, okay, if the car explodes, how many people will die? What will we have to pay as a result of that lawsuit versus if we don't bring this car to market, Volkswagen kind of takes over the market and we lose market share in a huge way. That cost benefit analysis was a business decision that supposedly let these executives and engineers led them to decide, make the decision to not tell anyone, not tell Lee Iacocca about these findings. Now, the culture there was also one that, don't bring problems. It's a cost benefit analysis, do the analysis and move forward based on that. So people didn't look at it at the time as an ethical decision. They looked at it as a business decision. And this is one of the blind spots where it seems so obvious in hindsight that they knowingly made an unethical decision, but at the time it seemed very different. Another example is accounting firms. So accounting firms that do annual audits of large businesses, and I think we saw some of this with Enron, do these large audits with businesses. They may see slight little aberrations, but nothing egregious and wildly illegal year after year. But they push it to let this one slide and that one slide because accounting isn't an exact science. So a little bit here and a little bit there. As it builds up over the years, they get used to making these slight, this will be okay, and these accounting kind of errors or these unethical accounting practices can kind of build up insidiously. So these are two examples where they seem very obvious in hindsight, but when you're in it day to day, and if you don't have a culture that highlights these to look out for, like you don't have a good thinking manifesto to rely on, and it hasn't been inculcated in your culture, you may be party to some of these unethical decisions unknowingly. But here are the six, I think there's 6 main things to look out for. Number 1, overclaiming credit. Now, we all do this. And how many of you think that you do, maybe you have a partner, husband, wife, that you do more than your fair share of the work in the family? How many of you think you do more than your fair share? Raise your hand. All right. Now, have you ever been on a work assignment or even back in school, a school assignment where you thought, why am I doing such an unfair share of this work? Well, this is very common. Not to say that you aren't doing the unfair share, but it turns out that research is really robust about how often and how much we consistently overclaim credit. As a matter of fact, but the way to overcome it is to actually identify what people are doing, how much time they're actually spending, and then bring your own analysis into the equation. And it has to add up to 100%. So the way it works is this. Let's say I'm working on a project at work and it's across a whole bunch of different departments, is really understanding what all the contributions are and how much time those take, maybe because I don't really understand how long it takes in engineering, for example, or how long it takes to do some of the things that I just don't do. So being aware of the time and effort that other people put in, and adding that, and then adding your own time and effort, knowing that it can only add up to 100%, is a way that you can avoid overclaiming credit. And the problem with the overclaiming credit is that we base our decisions on what we perceive as fair, and fairness is in our brains. So recent neuroscience has showed that the activity in the reward center of our brain, which is the striatum, this is activated by a money reward more when we think we worked harder or longer for that reward. So we will value, if we think we worked harder or longer than someone else, we will value fairness it'll trigger fairness in a totally different way in our brain. So it's very important that we get to where we are closer to assigning credit in a more equitable and more factual way. All right. So that's overclaiming credit. And there's a real reason why we want to make sure we correct for that, even though it might feel good that we say we did all the work. Number 2, implicit and explicit in-group favoritism. Now, we're hearing a lot about implicit bias in the news, learning about how we pattern match without even knowing it. And the research is really difficult because most of the research on implicit bias and most of the training about implicit bias makes us aware of implicit bias, but there's very little evidence that awareness leads to a reliable reduction in implicit bias, which is a little disconcerting. Primarily because the implicit bias is that we match things. So, for example, there is a very famous study in the implicit bias research where Asian women were triggered to either be made aware of their gender or their ethnicity. So subjects in group 1, they were made aware of their gender, and subjects in group 2 were made aware of their ethnicity. And then they took a math test. And because of this bias, with a lot of people believing that Asians are better at math, these women scored better when they were triggered to think about their ethnicity than when they were triggered to think about their gender. So awareness of implicit bias, and by the way, I think the results stood up even after an awareness of implicit bias was brought up. Explicit bias looks tricky because we don't really necessarily see it when we do it. But a good example is, a 1990 Department of Education study found that a typical Harvard legacy student, meaning a student that got into Harvard, maybe one of the reasons or a primary reason was that their mom, dad, or someone in their family went to Harvard. So that's a Harvard legacy. But that they found that they were significantly less qualified than the average non-legacy student in all relevant areas except for sports. So we know that there is some lack of fairness with in-group explicit bias. Now, a legacy admission is an explicit bias. It's actually not something that's going on just in your brain, but something you're actually doing. Now, one of the things we don't see in explicit bias that we don't think about is when we help our children, or we help our friends, or we help people that we like to maybe get an internship or a job. Now, I would venture to say that Washington, D.C. could not run without unpaid interns. And we know that the door to income inequality starts where income starts, and that often starts in an unpaid internship. But when we help our own children get these internships, that can be a form of explicit bias. It doesn't feel that way because we're biologically meant to help our own children. But that can be a form of explicit bias. And that leads to unfair decisions. So what we could do is just not allow unpaid internships. It would be incredibly unfortunate because you could say, well, what about just getting certain people access to unpaid internships? Again, then we identify the groups that we want, and then there's always down the road, there is always an element where we can say that's not unethical or unfair. So we could eliminate unpaid internships. We could say, not going to help my own kid. Or when we get a call from someone saying, hey, can you help my kid get this paid internship, or unpaid internship rather, or job, we could say, nope, not going to do it. It's not very likely that we think that that is unethical behavior when we help our own children get internships, but it can lead to income inequality and what could be perceived as a lack of fairness. We should just be aware that our implicit and explicit biases in helping our friends and helping people in group can lead to unethical behavior. So just an awareness and to check ourselves. Number 3, and that's in-group favoritism. Now, the bias is slightly different because we might have bias with age or race or gender. And like I said, knowing about these implicit biases does not eliminate them entirely. So we've got the in-group and out-group kind of bias, and then we've got these implicit biases. Like we might even say, we might even be able to say, okay, we're going to identify the word dangerous and spider faster, those two words together, faster than that we would identify dangerous and butterfly, for example. And that is how a lot of the rate that we pattern match is part of this IAT, implicit bias association. All right, number 4 is indirect unethical behavior. And this is really more common than we think when we unknowingly allow someone else to do something that is unethical. Not to say that we need to turn them in, but we actually may even encourage unethical behavior. So I'm going to take a minute to say, anyone else tuning in with comments? I'm not really seeing good comments, so I don't know if it's a function of yeah, it might be a function of my scroll. Anyway, so this is indirect unethical behavior. We don't commit it, but we get someone else to kind of do our dirty work. And maybe we tell our accountant, just do whatever it takes. Our accountant says, well, I'm seeing some things, and we say, just do whatever it takes. I want you to kind of, do your job. I'm not telling you what to do, but do whatever it takes. Do the aggressive accounting. Or there was a case of a large pharmaceutical company that had a pharmaceutical product that was really, really, really important to a very small number of people. So it was life-saving, but to a small number of people. And to be profitable and to show their investors the return on their investment, they would have to raise their price so that it would be quite expensive, like from $5 a pill maybe to $14 a pill. And but they felt that that would reflect poorly on them. So rather than raise their prices, they sold the rights to this drug to a smaller pharmaceutical company. And then that pharmaceutical company launched the product at the higher price. Now, the original large pharmaceutical company was still manufacturing the pharmaceutical companies, kind of like on behalf of, for the other company. But that is a way, that's kind of an example of what could be perceived as indirect unethical behavior. Now, we might look at that and say, yeah, well, that's business. That's what we have to do. That's capitalism. We have to show our investors a return on their investment. We need to show growth. And the only way we can grow when we don't have more of the people with this disorder is to increase the price of this drug that we spent, decades or years developing. So you can start to see where ethics is not exact, because you could say, this is a business decision, or we didn't do it. This is indirect unethical behavior. What can we do to counteract this? We can camouflage the intent by pretending we don't notice it, but the key is to notice it, and that's required in the Good Thinking Manifesto. The key is that to understand that what we perceive is never all that there is, and to perceive beyond. So those are some very important things that we need to identify and perceive is when we are making decisions based on indirect unethical behavior. And the next one, number 5, and we're rounding it down, is fake sacred values. And fake sacred values, we might see this as moral outrage or moral cleansing. We assume that emotions follow moral assessments. But the research suggests something different. So the research suggests that we have different moral foundations that we hold true. And there's not one that's right and one that's wrong. Some people value authority. That is so important, authority. And it's also cultural. Some people value care, like really human suffering and alleviating human suffering is the core value. Not to say that people who value authority don't value care. It's just how they get there, how you get there. We've got people who value sanctity, and they would say, the sanctity of the flag or the sanctity of my religion. Or some people value loyalty as the moral foundation. We all value these things to a certain degree, but it's a matter of degree. And fairness. So these are some of the things that form our moral foundations. Our emotions kind of sit between our moral foundations and our decisions. So it really shows that our moral foundations trigger these emotions, these responsive reactive emotions, and that creates our decisions. So we can overcome this if we know more about how morals and values exist, and if we really try to understand other people, not from whether they are right or wrong, or whether they're ethical or unethical, but we start by understanding what their moral foundations might be. So for me, I have a very low authority moral foundation. So when someone says, oh, you need to follow, even in school, you need to listen to your teacher, you need to respect your teacher. But if I didn't respect the teacher, for maybe I didn't find that teacher respectable, I didn't value her or his authority in the same way. So I have a low, even with my bosses, I have a low authority foundation. That isn't meant to be good or bad. But if you know that about me and you're my boss, or you know that about me and you're my employee, you might understand where I'm coming from, and you might be able to not apply your fake sacred values, your values, to my decisions, if that makes sense. All right. And the final thing that really can contribute to unknowing, unethical decisions is our psychological conflicts of interest. And we see this all the time. So, for example, during the financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis, leading up to that, there was a big push, a huge push toward home ownership. In the United States, home ownership was just the pinnacle of what the American dream. And so the idea was to make home ownership more available for more people. So there was a huge push from the top, the president, all the way through society, to make mortgages more available. And in doing that, there was a lot of push to make mortgages affordable and available to people who probably couldn't afford those mortgages. And that is a psychological conflict of interest. You might also see it when surgeons get paid more, the more surgery they perform. And if they're not performing surgery, they're not making, so then surgeons might see the need for surgery. So there's a psychological conflict of interest. And when we are in it, it's really hard to see. It's really, really hard to see, because we all view data from a self-serving perspective. It's evolutionary. And so we have to create, the way to get around this is to create incentives for ourselves for noticing and pointing out our own conflicts of interest. We can certainly start by seeing conflicts of interest in other people. That's usually not that difficult. You see your stockbroker makes a little nugget of money on every transaction. So they're doing all these transactions, and you might wonder, is my financial advisor making money because are they making these transactions because it betters my portfolio, or are they making these transactions because they get a commission on each of these transactions? So we can see this in other people, but where it gets difficult is to turn around and see it in ourselves. So it's very important to try to identify potential conflicts of interest and not beat ourselves up. Just know that that helps us move toward more ethical and fair decision making. And it moves us closer to good thinking. We may want to believe that people with severe mental illness can just be given a pill and set out in society. And so we may, or maybe we want to believe that if we have more affordable housing, that people with schizophrenia will just be able to just afford to live harmoniously and healthily. And so we vote for this bond measure to create more affordable housing. And that doesn't seem at all unethical. It doesn't even seem unfair, but we're operating without the data. And we might step back and say, is that a form of moral outrage? Are we using kind of this fake value narrative? How do we need to get more data before we just put our vote, because that's what our political or our moral foundation tells us, that we should care about these people, and so voting for more affordable housing, for example, will automatically kind of satisfy what my requirement, my contribution. Not to say that it won't, but just questioning and questioning and questioning these 6, the psychological conflict of interest, the overclaiming credit, the in-group favoritism, the implicit attitudes and biases, and what did I say is the last one? I think that's it. And an indirect unethical behavior. I have to have my notes. And fake sacred values. Just identifying these things in our own thinking and challenging ourselves to see things that might not be so obvious can help us avoid making unknowingly unethical or unfair decisions. And it gets us closer to good thinking. All right, so that's the show. Hope you enjoyed the live broadcast. And if you're seeing this later, definitely weigh in on your thoughts. Would you take the $4,900 or the $100 if the other person took the $4,900? Yes, no, depends. And tune in next week, Monday, 9 a.m. Portland Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live. And let me know if you want a copy of the Good Thinking Manifesto, and then go to YouTube and smash that bell, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.